and an artichoke of 10 times more value than any amount of asbestos. But my uncle was not a man to be kept waiting. So, adjourning, therefore, all minor questions, I presented myself before him. He was a very learned man. Now, most persons in this category supply themselves with information as peddlers do with goods, for the benefit of others, and lay up stores in order to diffuse them abroad for the benefit of society in general. Not so my excellent uncle, Professor Hardwigg. He studied, he consumed the midnight oil, he pored over heavy tomes and digested huge quartos and folios in order to keep the knowledge acquired to himself. There was a reason, and it may be regarded as a good one, why my uncle refused to display his learning more than was absolutely necessary. He stammered, and when intent upon explaining the phenomena of the heavens, was apt to find himself at fault, and allude in such a vague way to sun, moon, and stars that few were able to comprehend his meaning. To tell the honest truth, when the right word wouldn't come, it was generally replaced by a very powerful adjective. In connection with the sciences, there are many almost unpronounceable names very much resembling those of Welsh villages, and my uncle, being very fond of using them, his habit of stammering was not thereby improved. In fact, there were periods in his discourse when he'd finally give up and swallow his discomfiture in a glass of water. As I said, my uncle, Professor Hardwigg, was a very learned man. And I now add, a most kind relative. I was bound to him by the double ties of affection and interest. I took deep interest in all his doings, and hoped someday to be almost as learned myself. It was a rare thing for me to be absent from his lectures. Like him, I preferred mineralogy to all the other sciences. My anxiety was to gain real knowledge of the earth. Geology and mineralogy were to us the sole objects of life, and in connection with these studies, many a fair specimen of stone, chalk, or metal did we break with our hammers. Steel rods, lodestone, glass pipes, and bottles of various acids were oftener before us than our meals. My uncle Hardwigg was once known to classify 600 different geological specimens by their weight, hardness, fusibility, sound, taste, and smell. He corresponded with all the great learned and scientific men of the age. I was, therefore, in constant communication with, at all events, the letters of Sir Humphrey Davy, Captain Franklin, and other great men. But before I state the subject on which my uncle wished to confer with me, I must say a word about his personal appearance. Alas, you will see a very different portrait of him at a future time, after he's gone through the fearful adventures yet to be related. My uncle was 50 years old, tall, thin, and wiry. Large spectacles hid to a certain extent his vast, round, and goggle eyes, while his nose was irreverently compared to a thin file. So much, indeed, did it resemble that useful article, that a compass was said in his presence to have made considerable deviation. The truth being told, however, the only article really attracted to my uncle's nose was tobacco. Another peculiarity of his was that he always stepped a yard at a time, clenched his fists as if he were going to hit you, and was, when in one of his peculiar humors, very far from a pleasant companion. It's further necessary to observe that he lived in a very nice house, in that very nice street, the Königstrasse, in Hamburg. Though lying in the center of town, it was perfectly rural in its aspect, half wood, half bricks, with old-fashioned gables, one of the few old houses spared by the great fire of 1842. When I say a nice house, I mean a handsome house, old, tottering, and not exactly comfortable to English notions, a house a little off the perpendicular and inclined to fall into the neighboring canal, exactly the house for a wandering artist to depict. All the more that you could scarcely see it for ivy and a magnificent old tree which grew over the door. My uncle was rich. His house was his own property, and he had a considerable private income. To my notion, the best part of his possessions was his goddaughter, Gretchen, and the old cook, the young lady, the professor, and I were the sole inhabitants. I loved mineralogy. I loved geology. To me, there was nothing like pebbles. And if my uncle had been in a little less of a fury, we should have been the happiest of families. To prove the excellent Hardwigg's impatience, I solemnly declare that when the flowers in the drawing-room pots began to grow, he rose every morning at 4 o'clock to make them grow quicker by pulling the leaves. Having described my uncle, I will now give an account of our interview. He received me in his study, a perfect museum containing every natural curiosity that can well be imagined. Minerals, however, predominating. Every one was familiar to me, having been catalogued by my own hand. My uncle, apparently oblivious of the fact that he had summoned me to his presence, was absorbed in a book. He was particularly fond of early editions, tall copies, and unique works. "Wonderful!" he cried, tapping his forehead. "Wonderful! Wonderful!" It was one of those yellow-leaved volumes now rarely found on stalls, and to me it appeared to possess but little value. My uncle, however, was in raptures. He admired its binding, the clearness of its characters, the ease with which it opened in his hand, and repeated aloud half a dozen times that it was very, very old. To my fancy, he was making a great fuss about nothing, but it wasn't my province to say so. On the contrary, I professed considerable interest in the subject, and asked him what it was about. "It is the Heimskringla of Snorre Tarlsson," he said, "the celebrated Icelandic author of the 12th century. It is a true and correct account of the Norwegian princes who reigned in Iceland." My next question related to the language in which it was written. I hoped, at all events, it was translated into German. My uncle was indignant at the very thought, and declared he wouldn't give a penny for a translation. His delight was to have found the original work in the Icelandic tongue, which he declared to be one of the most magnificent and yet simple idioms in the world, while at the same time its grammatical combinations were the most varied known to students. "About as easy as German?" was my insidious remark. My uncle shrugged his shoulders. "The letters, at all events," I said, "are rather difficult of comprehension. It is a Runic manuscript, the language of the original population of Iceland, invented by Odin himself," cried my uncle, angry at my ignorance. I was about to venture upon some misplaced joke on the subject, when a small scrap of parchment fell out of the leaves. Like a hungry man snatching at a morsel of bread, the professor seized it. It was about 5 inches by 3, and was scrawled over in the most extraordinary fashion. The lines written on the venerable piece of parchment have wonderful importance, as they induced my uncle to undertake the most wonderful series of adventures which ever fell to the lot of human beings. My uncle looked keenly at the document for some moments, and then declared that it was Runic. The letters were similar to those in the book, but then what did they mean? This was exactly what I wanted to know. Now, as I had a strong conviction that the Runic alphabet and dialect were simply an invention to mystify poor human nature, I was delighted to find that my uncle knew as much about the matter as I did, which was nothing. At all events, the tremulous motion of his fingers made me think so. "And yet," he muttered to himself, "it is old Icelandic, I'm sure of it." and my uncle ought to have known, for he was a perfect polyglot dictionary in himself. He didn't pretend, like a certain learned pundit, to speak the 2,000 languages and 4,000 idioms made use of in different parts of the globe, but he did know all the more important ones. It's a matter of great doubt to me now to what violent measures my uncle's impetuosity might have led him, had not the clock struck 2, and our old French cook called out to let us know that dinner was on the table. "Bother the dinner!" cried my uncle. But I was hungry. I sallied forth to the dining room, where I took up my usual quarters. Out of politeness, I waited 3 minutes, but no sign of my uncle, the professor. I was surprised. He wasn't usually so blind to the pleasure of a good dinner. It was the acme of German luxury: parsley soup, a ham omelette with sorrel trimmings, an oyster of veal stewed with prunes, delicious fruit, and sparkling moselle. For the sake of poring over this musty old piece of parchment, my uncle forbore to share our meal. To satisfy my conscience, I ate for both. The old cook and housekeeper was nearly out of her mind. After taking so much trouble to find her master not appear at dinner was to her a sad disappointment, which, as she occasionally watched the havoc I was making on the viands, became also alarm. What if my uncle were to come to table after all? Suddenly, just as I'd consumed the last apple and drunk the last glass of wine, a terrible voice was heard at no great distance. It was my uncle, roaring for me to come to him. I made very nearly one leap of it, so loud, so fierce was his tone. Chapter 2. The Mysterious Parchment. "I declare," cried my uncle, striking the table fiercely with his fist, "I declare to you it's Runic, and contains some wonderful secret which I must get at any price." I was about to reply when he stopped me. "Sit down," he said fiercely, "and write to my dictation." I obeyed. "I will substitute," he said, "a letter of our alphabet for that of the Runic. We will then see what that will produce. Now, begin, and make no mistakes." The dictation commenced with incomprehensible result. Scarcely giving me time to finish, my uncle snatched the document from my hands and examined it with the most rapt and deep attention. "I should like to know what it means," he said after a long period. I certainly couldn't tell him, nor did he expect me to, his conversation being uniformly answered by himself. "I declare it puts me in mind of a cryptograph," he cried. "Unless, indeed, the letters have been written without any real meaning, and yet why take so much trouble? Who knows but I may be on the verge of some great discovery?" My candid opinion was that it was all rubbish. But this opinion I kept carefully to myself, as my uncle's choler wasn't pleasant to bear. All this time he was comparing the book with the parchment. "The manuscript volume and the smaller document are written in different hands," he said. "The cryptograph is of much later date than the book. There's an undoubted proof of the correctness of my surmise. An irrefragable proof I took it to be. The first letter is a double M, which was only added to the Icelandic language in the 12th century. This makes the parchment 200 years posterior to the volume." The circumstances appeared very probable and very logical, but it was all surmise to me. "To me it appears probable that this sentence was written by some owner of the book. Now, who was the owner is the next important question. Perhaps by great good luck it may be written somewhere in the volume." With these words, Professor Hardwigg took off his spectacles, and taking a powerful